Welcome to Managing Through Crisis, the webcast featuring faculty from Harvard Business School sharing insights for managers on how to navigate through the COVID-19 crisis. Today, we're going to talk about supply chain. Supply chain is not usually the most trendy topic in business until it is. The pandemic put a spotlight on supply chain issues early on as panic stricken consumers cleared store shelves of pretty much everything, uncertain when supplies would be replenished. Were those concerns justified? And what does the future hold with regard to supply chains? Today, we're fortunate to have Professor Willy Shih joining us. Willy is an expert in manufacturing and product development, and of course, supply chain. And more recently, he's become a sought after expert on toilet paper, of all things. Willy, thanks so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me, Brian.
I think as we were talking just now before we got started here, people are really thirsting for information about, how they can think about managing through this thing, both on a personal and professional level. And supply chain is one of those things that I think impacts people in both ways. They're consumers, but they're also managers, and they're interested in making sure that they can provide for whatever their needs are too as consumers. So I think there'll be a lot of interest in what you have to say today. But I'm going to ask you to start by talking about toilet paper, of all things. You had this article in Forbes on March 4th. It turned out to be a smash hit for you. But maybe you can just tell us why was toilet paper such a focal point early on?
Well, Brian, what happened with toilet paper is, first of all, what we're seeing is a very unusual time in the world. We're seeing a supply shock for things coming out of China starting in February, then coupled with a demand shock. Okay, and toilet paper was one of those manifestations. Now, what happened is I wrote this piece in Forbes about toilet paper because I heard from a former colleague of mine in Australia about how people were hoarding toilet paper, and she couldn't get any. And I had heard about these shortages in Japan and then Hong Kong, and I said, well, okay, so this is actually a useful way to teach people about supply chain. So I wrote this column because I said, well, first of all, toilet paper is a product that everybody understands. We use it, we understand it, and we also understand that demand is flat, right? It's like there's not like a season where you use more toilet paper, or there are not like occasions where you use more toilet paper, right? Therefore, if you think about what the supply chain for toilet paper should look like, it's you know uh, it's very voluminous, right? So, but I need to move it on a regular basis from the factories into the retail stores. And by and large, toilet paper, since it's bulky and it doesn't cost a lot, it has a low value density. So we think of it as not particularly tradable. It's not like I'm going to import toilet paper from China. I'm going to, by and large, I'm going to make it within a region. Like for North America, the US is self sufficient in toilet paper, China is self sufficient in toilet paper, Europe is self sufficient in toilet paper, right? So it's kind of that nice, simple example. And what it highlights is how much resiliency do manufacturers and the supply chain have to sudden spikes in demand? Okay, so for example, the answer is, since I know toilet paper demand is going to be very flat, I'm not going to have a lot of surge capacity. Okay, now it turns out the demand shifted a little bit because people weren't using it in schools like us, or in offices or hotels and travel companies. But that's a different supply chain for that kind of commercial, industrial type toilet paper. Okay, so then you don't need a lot of demand surge to throw things way out of whack. So it's kind of exemplifies some of the crises we're seeing. Now, that also extends to, for example, things like masks, N95 masks, personal protective equipment, because in that case, we've seen, manufacturers in the US, like 3M, make some. A lot of people make it in China, and a lot of the personal protective equipment is manufactured in China because it's cheaper. Okay. And we've seen a lot of shortages, and people are saying, well, how come the US can't make more masks and personal protective equipment? And that starts to expose what some of the realities of manufacturing and supply chains are, which is I don't have a lot of surge capacity, right? Because if I have idle plant capacity, my investors are going to penalize me, or the analysts are going to penalize me. It's like, oh, you're running a factory at 50% capacity. Why do you have all that idle capacity? Because all of that goes into the cost equation. Okay, now I heard one number that the demand for mass has surged 20x, right?
Mhm.
Nobody is going to have the capacity for that. So now what we're seeing is we're seeing a lot of stress in the supply chains. Okay, and so that's kind of a picture of what's going on.
Yeah. So just for people, I don't want to assume that everybody who's watching this understands, the definition of supply chain. So let me just ask you quickly, what is your sort of your 30-second definition of what a supply chain is?
Well, for me, the supply chain is the series of manufacturers who will make my product and the logistics links that connect them. Okay. And so it's very much like a chain. I might buy a product from a retailer. Maybe I'll buy it from Amazon. Okay. Or maybe I'll buy it from the local grocery store. Okay. That retailer, for example, will have a supply chain that supplies those products behind it. So it'll have a manufacturer connected through a distribution center. And then that manufacturer may also use other suppliers who we refer to as tiers on the supply chain. Okay, so the product manufacturer may have a set of suppliers who might be what we would call tier one suppliers. Okay, those suppliers in turn might have others, right? So you think of it as a long chain of manufacturers connected by logistics links, which bring together all the raw materials, assemble them into finished products, and deliver them to your point of purchase.
Great. That's very helpful. We had some great questions sent in by our viewers. So I want to get right to those because people are thinking a lot about this actually.
For
One
sure.
of them had to do with the economics of supply chains and how the pandemic impacts kind of the economics of supply chains around the world.
Well, there are one of the things that this pandemic has exposed is how globalized most supply chains are. So, for example, uh, we all know with things like smartphones and computers that many of the final assembly operations actually happen in China or in Asia, and a lot of the components are drawn from China, East Asia as well. All of those come together in China and they're shipped over to us. What people haven't really paid attention to is how many other products have some link in that supply chain that goes through China. So, for example, blood oxygenators or things like active pharmaceutical ingredients, which is something that has gotten a lot of attention recently. A lot of generic pharmaceuticals actually are manufactured in India using what are called active pharmaceutical ingredients, which come out of China, right? So now you can think of a chain where that ibuprofen that you pick up in the grocery store actually had chemical compounds that come out of China, were shipped to India, where they formulated them into ibuprofen, and then they shipped them to distributors around the world, and then eventually they make it into the drugstore. So I think this shock, okay, I mentioned earlier the supply shock. The supply shock came when China shut down, right? China was the first one to have this coronavirus impact in Hubei province in Wuhan, okay, and they basically shut down the country for an extended Lunar New Year break. Okay, normally the Lunar New Year would have started around January 25th, but what they did is they extended the break. Now, one of the reasons we didn't see a lot of impact for a while is because many companies who source materials and products from China could anticipate this Lunar New Year break. And so they knew, oh, okay, everybody's going to shut down for a week starting around January 25th. And by the way, the last shipments coming out of China would leave around January 25th. And about anywhere from uh, 30 to 40 days later, you would see that last shipment arrive uh, either, on the East Coast of the US or in Europe or somewhere like that. Okay, so there was this delayed impact. Okay, then the Lunar New Year break was extended, and many factories really didn't get going again until mid-March. So now there was this uh, gap in terms of product supply. Okay, and uh, we often think of this kind of delayed reaction through a supply chain as a bullwhip effect. It's like just when I needed more from you guys, you're not shipping anymore, right? And so I'm going to order more, right? So what happened is we had this shortfall at the end of February where people were putting in emergency orders and give me expedite shipments and stuff like that. Okay, and so then as soon as China got back to work, they started, filling all those back orders just at a time when economies in the US and Europe started to shut down. So we had a supply shock, then collide with a demand shock where people stopped buying furniture, clothing, shoes, anything outside of medical supplies and groceries, right? So we had this rather unique combination of supply shock meets demand shock, and it made a horrible mess.
So part of what you're saying is pretty alarming in the sense that our supply chain is global in nature. We are all connected, through this global series sets of providers and shippers and logistics. Does this mean we need to be rethinking the global nature of the supply chain and going back to much more of a supply chain, for instance, in the U.S. where we are making and buying everything locally?
Well, there are two uh, questions really embedded in that. Okay, the first one is one of resilience, right? How resilient am I to disruptions that come along? Okay, now, admittedly, this disruption has been really quite massive uh, in terms of all the other disruptions that we've seen in the last century, right? Because basically, we have put the US economy into a medically induced coma, and Europe as well. Right? So that's that's a major shock. Now, the first question is resilience. To the extent that I am dependent on this dispersed supply chain, how good am I at withstanding those shocks? Now, one of the things you can do is you can have strategic inventory, right? You can have stockpiles of things that you might want to have in case I'm cut off, right? I think what has happened is especially the last 20 years, where we've seen uh, big leaps in kind of the efficiency and lower cost of international shipping, primarily through container ships, but also through air cargo. And this uh, efficient, dependable transportation logistics between the links of the supply chain has lulled everybody into thinking, well, gee, I can build this supply chain with minimal inventory, just or safety stock. Oftentimes we talk about safety stock in case I run out. Okay, so the first thing is that has been disproven by what we are experiencing now. Okay, and one way you can solve that is like you can say, I want to diversify my supplies. I want to maybe not be quite so dependent on one country or one region of the world, and that might be a push back to being more regional. Okay, and I think we will see some of that. Okay, the second issue that's embedded in that is, do we want to be more self-sufficient, or at least regionally more self-sufficient? And you'll see a lot of people kind of jumping on the deglobalization bandwagon, saying, okay, this is the end of globalization. We really don't want to be dependent on other countries so much anymore. I would say be careful when you ask for that, okay, because the world is remarkably interdependent right now, and that has benefited everybody. If you look at kind of the cornucopia of products that we are able to buy at low cost, it's because we trade with so many people around the world who can specialize in doing different things. This sort of the foundation of the whole Ricardian notion of trade. Okay, and so if you talk about uh, I want to regionalize more, we're necessarily going to have to uh, spend more for our products, maybe have less variety, because not every country is capable of providing that wealth, that range of products by itself. Okay, the U.S. is more capable than a lot of countries, but you would be surprised how many things we are dependent on. Not only China, okay, but European countries, South Africa, Canada, Mexico, lots of other places for those products. And by the way, they're dependent on us as well.
So we had one of our viewers asked a question about GM and their move to make ventilators. And, I had the same thought, which is how does a company that makes cars all of a sudden turn on a dime and make ventilators? Where do they get the parts, the expertise, and the skill to do something like that?
Yes. Well, when I first heard that, I was a little skeptical as well, right? Because when you think about the Defense Procurement Act and when it was invoked during World War II, uh, I don't want to minimize the effort, but things were a little simpler in those days. Okay, and ventilators are very complex products that require FDA certification. Now, what is very interesting to me about this is, like, if you look at, for example, GM as an example, they converted a factory that wasn't being used. I think it was in Kokomo, Indiana. It was probably a former Delco factory or something that made small subsystems or components. Uh, they partnered with Ventec, which is a company that has uh, had a design, right? Had an existing design, and it's like, how do we scale larger, right? So, I think GM did not behave in a crazy fashion here, right? I mean, there were some of our leaders in government who said, "Oh, you can make cars, you can make ventilators," right? GM actually recognized that they can't do a lot of those things, but they do know what they can do is help on procurement. They could provide labor, they could provide a building and things like that. So what I found really very gratifying is the crisis has unfrozen how a lot of people think about what they can and cannot do, right? So it's brought on a kind of new flexibility to work very differently. And actually, managers should think about that, because it's like, why does it take a crisis for me to kind of unfreeze my organization and be able to do new things? It's like, that's actually very instructive, right? Because uh, that actually means when the crisis uh, passes, I should also think about my other capabilities that way as well, which is, it's like, I could really do new things. So I think they've uh, taken a pretty good approach, but it's a hard problem, right? Because you want a product that is certified safe for hospital use. This is not like taking the HVAC system from a car and then running it to your lungs. Okay, it has to be FDA certified. But at the same time, we've also seen this unfreezing apply to the FDA as well, who has relaxed some of the uh, certification requirements for those production facilities.
Yeah. I want to go back to the discussion we had a moment ago about globalization. I'm wondering, we had a viewer write in and ask about how do you get, how can consumers get products if stores are closed, or how can you get consumers feeling comfortable going back into local brick and mortar establishments? So my question is, do you see this? We've heard a lot about farm to table restaurants, for instance, in the past, 5 or 6 years. That's become pretty popular. There does seem to be, on the one hand, this movement towards locally made, locally grown, products and services. Is this an opportunity for that kind of provider to thrive in the absence of or with interruptions to the global supply chain?
Uh, uh, my answer to your question is yes, I think it is. Okay, what we've seen is a lot of local providers pivoting to providing mail order or delivery. Okay, and those who uh, kind of used the crisis to unfreeze what they thought their business model was, and pivoted, I think potentially could do very well, right? So, uh, what the crisis has also done is we've seen uh, the impact on the logistics links in the supply chains. Okay, so uh, there's been huge dislocations in that. In the United States, for example, what we've seen is much heavier demand on trucking for restocking grocery stores, okay, and the food and medical supplies. At the same time, where we've seen a collapse of demand for uh, uh, trucking to supply industrial production. Okay, and normally that's a very balanced system where people arrange backhauls and so on. But we've made life very difficult for people who are trying to uh, supply, the necessities, groceries, and so on. We even see, for example, companies like Amazon struggling to keep up. Okay, and so there's been uh, a lot of changes that have impacted the logistics network. Okay, and I always think about logistics as one of those unseen things because a lot of the trucking and the restocking happens at night. Uh, but it's a really well-tuned and well-oiled network which we've thrown out of kilter with this disruption. Okay, and that's why we're seeing shortages in stores as uh, people try to pivot to the new realities. You see that among uh, uh, the commercial food providers, for example, like the Cisco's, who serve restaurants and institutional food service, where suddenly demand has dried up. But the materials that they sell, and it breaks your heart when you see farmers saying there's nobody buying all this produce, so I'm going to destroy it, when in reality you don't see it in the grocery store. We've seen that with milk and so on. And this because the institutional supply chains uh, are a little different from the consumer supply chains, and we've gotten things out of balance here.
These are great insights, Willie. I'm going to hold you for two more questions and then we'll let you get back to your day. One of them just sort of keys off what you were just saying. We've heard a lot about disruption in meat processing plants,
Hmm.
stories coming out of South Dakota with the pork industry. There's been speculation that we will face shortages of meat going forward. I'm not going to ask you to predict the future on that, but the question has to do more with um, how can institutions prepare for interruptions that may lie ahead?
Yeah, I think that's a critical question. Okay, now we can actually look to China for a lot of these things in terms of restarting production. So if it's a packing plant in the Dakotas, or if it's an auto company, right? I think uh, and the Europeans are starting to follow the same practices in terms of uh, cleanliness and hygiene, in terms of distancing. How are we going to rearrange production lines, right? So, I mean, I think we're going to be in a new era in terms of how we manage this type of thing. My hope is people are going to give more thought to the importance of carrying inventory and safety stock so that I can survive some of these disruptions, especially around critical commodities. I visited a factory a couple years ago. It was actually Novo Nordisk's factory in Kalundborg, Denmark, and they make 50% of the world's supply of insulin. Okay, and in one factory. And I talked to them about that. It's like, how do you feel about that risk? And they said, we realize that we have a responsibility to be able to provide to people. Because can you imagine not being able to provide half the world's supply of insulin like that? They have a 5-year stock, uh, in the deep freeze, just to kind of protect their customers, right? But uh, we're in an era where uh, we've had some business leaders talk about inventory is evil, right? And I understand why you don't want to have a lot of inventory, especially with fashion goods or things that go out of obsolete, or the carrying cost of holding inventories. Okay, but maybe we need to rethink some of those things based on the lessons that we've learned here.
That's so one last question that keys off of that one nicely, which is that, we've got a financial, situation in Wall Street where short-termism has been the focus for a long time, and companies are expected to make their numbers and to be accurate in their predictions. Do you see this kind of thing sort of changing the way we think about financial forecasting going forward and how the markets operate? Will they be more lenient, I guess, is the question, to firms that are trying to figure out how to adapt in this situation?
Well, we can hope that's the case. I hate to end on a down note, but I'm kind of pessimistic about that. Okay, and the reason I'm pessimistic about that, I was talking to somebody about N95 masks. Now it turns out that I was buying some last summer because I was doing some dusty work. Okay, so you go to Home Depot and you go to the paint aisle and you can see N95 masks. Well, in those days you could buy them at Home Depot. You can't anymore. But the question gets down to, if you're a consumer and you see N95 masks that are higher cost because they are made locally and there's that kind of surge capacity to supply you in an emergency versus one that costs half as much that was made in a low cost country but otherwise is equivalent, which one are you going to buy? Okay, and that's the problem that uh, is going to take a lot of rethinking. How do I get around that? And so I'm a little pessimistic on that because it reflects, at the end, it's price competition that drives this type of behavior. I haven't figured out how we get around that.
Willie, thanks so much for the insights and for the candor. Great conversation.
Well, thanks for having me.